Emotional goal. Introduce the narrator's curiosity, admiration, and subtle nervousness. Hint at playful tension and emotional warmth. Narrative progression. The younger man visits his friend's house, is introduced to her mother, and experiences their first small, teasing interaction in the kitchen. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on touch, glances, body language, and the quiet hum of shared domestic space. I had always thought of my friend's mom, Claire, as untouchable in a way most people reserve for celebrities or childhood legends. At 42, she carried herself with that rare kind of ease, calm, confident, but not unapproachable. I'd been to her house countless times before, but today was different. Today, she was cooking, and I had somehow volunteered to help. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I was hit by the warmth of the room, the gentle golden glow of the late afternoon sunlight, the soft aroma of garlic sautéing in olive oil, and the comforting hum of an old radio playing something soft in the background. Claire was at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, apron tied neatly at her waist. Her movements were deliberate, graceful. The way she sliced vegetables was almost hypnotic. "I hope you're ready to learn," she said without looking at me, her tone teasing but not sharp. I could hear the smile in her voice, subtle, like a secret shared. "Absolutely," I said, trying to sound confident, though my hands itched to fidget. She handed me a small piece of the sauce she was working on. "Taste this, see if it needs more salt." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, a glint of mischief dancing in the corners. I swallowed hard, the heat of the kitchen mixing with the flutter in my chest. The sauce was perfect, rich, balanced, and comforting. I nodded, trying not to let my admiration slip too obviously into my tone. "It's incredible. You make it look effortless." Her laugh was soft, the kind that warmed the room. "Effortless?" she repeated, tilting her head. "I've had years of practice, but you notice." Her glance lingered just a moment too long, and I felt the subtle brush of tension between us, delicate, almost like electricity you could feel but not yet name. As I leaned forward to stir the pot at her suggestion, our hands brushed. Just once, fleeting, but long enough to send a strange, steady warmth up my arm. I looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the sauce, but I could sense her gaze tracing me, playful, unspoken. Even in that simple act, tasting, stirring, sharing a laugh, something shifted. There was a small, quiet intimacy in the ordinary, a smile that lingered too long, a joke that landed softly, a shared space that suddenly felt charged with possibility. I realized that this was not just about learning to cook. This was the first taste of something unexpected, a connection neither of us yet fully understood, but both were acutely aware of. By the time I left the kitchen that afternoon, my thoughts were tangled with the scent of garlic, the warmth of sunlight, and the memory of her eyes, sharp, teasing, and yet profoundly gentle. And though nothing had been said, I knew something had begun, something slow, tender, and quietly irresistible. Emotional goal: build playful rapport, deepen the subtle emotional connection, and introduce hints of tension through teasing and shared vulnerability. Narrative progression: the narrator spends more time in the kitchen, helping Claire with cooking. Their teasing grows, and the narrator begins to notice small, intimate details about her. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on glances, gestures, small touches, body language, laughter, and the warmth of shared domesticity. I returned the next afternoon, a little earlier than planned, carrying the same nervous excitement that had clung to me the day before. The door opened before I could knock, and there she was, Claire, aproned again, leaning casually against the doorway, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice light, teasing. There was something in the way she said it, a mixture of surprise and amusement, that made my chest tighten just slightly. "I thought I could be useful," I said, and immediately realized how awkward it sounded. Her laugh, soft and melodic, filled the hallway, making me wish I had rehearsed a better line. "Useful," she echoed, stepping aside to let me in. "We'll see about that." Her eyes sparkled with quiet mischief as she led me into the kitchen, the air still rich with lingering scents of last night's cooking. Rosemary, butter, a hint of lemon. This time, I was helping with a more complicated recipe, one that required precision and timing. Claire's instructions were gentle, patient, but every now and then, she'd reach past me to adjust my grip on a knife or show me how to fold the batter just right. Our hands brushed repeatedly, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, and each time, I felt a flicker of warmth, a sudden awareness of her presence. "You're too stiff," she said softly, nudging my shoulders with hers, just enough to make me stumble in a way that was both embarrassing and thrilling. "Relax. Cooking should feel alive." I laughed, a little self-conscious, but the sound felt easy here in this kitchen with her. There was a rhythm to our movements, a quiet synchronization, almost like a dance. When I glanced up, I caught her watching me, a subtle smile playing on her lips, and I felt my heart skip, not from fear or excitement alone, but from the recognition that she noticed me, really noticed me. Between stirring, tasting, and laughter, she shared little stories about her childhood, her first disastrous attempts at cooking, the quiet triumphs she'd savored over the years. Her voice had a softness to it when she spoke of vulnerability, a contrast to the confident, teasing persona she wore effortlessly. I found myself leaning just slightly closer, captivated not only by her words, but by the warmth of her presence, the steady rhythm of her breath, the quiet steadiness in her gaze. At one point, as I reached for a bowl, our fingers touched again. She didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she held the brief contact, almost as if she were savoring it too. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with an unspoken understanding, a connection that needed no words. By the time the timer on the oven rang, signaling our finished dish, I realized something remarkable. The kitchen had transformed. It wasn't just a place to cook anymore. It was a place where laughter lingered in the air, where hands could brush and hearts could race quietly, and where an ordinary afternoon could feel extraordinary. As I left that day, carrying a small container of our creation, I felt an ache of anticipation for the next conversation, the next laugh, the next accidental brush of hands. Something delicate and unspoken was blossoming between us, and I knew, without fully understanding it yet, that neither of us would be the same again. Emotional goal. Deepen emotional intimacy, show vulnerability, and heighten subtle tension through personal sharing and mutual understanding. Narrative progression. The narrator spends more time with Claire outside the kitchen, perhaps helping with errands or organizing the house, and they share moments of honesty and quiet emotional connection. Small touches and gestures reinforce the growing bond. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Emphasize glances, fleeting touches, tone of voice, pauses, laughter, and shared space in everyday tasks. It started with something small, helping Claire carry bags from the grocery store into her kitchen. The sun was low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the living room floor, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood made everything feel slow and intentional. "You always make this look easier than it is," I said, watching her carefully balance 2 bags in her arms. She laughed softly, the sound warm and effortless. "I've had practice." "You, on the other hand," she tilted her head, eyes meeting mine with a hint of amusement and something else I couldn't quite name. "You're learning." As we unpacked the groceries together, our movements fell into a natural rhythm, hands occasionally brushing as I handed her a bag, her fingers briefly grazing mine when she took something from my hands. Each touch was fleeting, but it carried a strange weight, a quiet awareness that neither of us ignored. After a while, we paused by the counter, taking a moment to rest. I noticed the small details I hadn't before. The faint scent of her perfume mixed with the fresh aroma of oranges she'd just set out, the soft way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. "You seem thoughtful today," she said, her voice low, inviting. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something about her presence made it easy to speak. "I guess. I just didn't realize how calming it is to be here," I admitted, "with you." It's different from anywhere else. Her expression softened, and she leaned slightly closer, not deliberately, but just enough for our shoulders to brush. "I'm glad," she said quietly. There was a pause, a gentle stillness in the air that felt intimate and deliberate. It's nice to have company that isn't just passing through. Someone who notices the little things. I swallowed, my pulse quickening despite the calm of the moment. I wanted to say more, about how her laughter lingered in my chest, how the warmth of her hand seemed to stay with me long after it had left mine. But the words felt too fragile, too new. Instead, I nodded, and our silence became a shared understanding, comfortable and charged at the same time. When she moved to set down a bag, our fingers brushed again, a soft accidental contact, yet neither of us pulled away immediately. I felt the quiet steadiness of her presence, like a lighthouse in a fog I hadn't even realized I was in. By the time I left that evening, carrying a small bag of leftovers she insisted I take, I was acutely aware of the change in our relationship. The playful teasing of the kitchen had deepened into something more intimate, a trust, a shared quiet that made ordinary moments feel like they carried weight. And as I walked home, the image of her glance, warm, teasing, and profoundly knowing, lingered in my mind, a quiet promise that this connection was only just beginning. Emotional goal: heighten the emotional and romantic tension through a private, quiet moment of closeness. Show hesitation, longing, and the magnetic pull between the narrator and Claire. Narrative progression. The narrator spends the evening at Claire's house for a casual dinner. Shared laughter, small touches, and lingering glances push their connection toward a subtle emotional peak, while neither crosses any explicit boundaries. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on glances, hand touches, body proximity, tone of voice, and the sensory details of the environment to build intimacy. I didn't expect to stay for dinner, but when Claire suggested I help her try a new recipe, I couldn't say no. The kitchen had transformed from a workspace into a quiet sanctuary of scents and soft light. Candles flickered on the counter, casting a warm glow across her face. "You're staying for dinner, right?" she asked. Not a question, but a gentle assertion. Her voice was low, comfortable, yet carried that teasing edge that always made my chest tighten. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, trying to sound casual while secretly feeling a flutter in my stomach. As we cooked, our hands met repeatedly, stirring the sauce, adjusting ingredients, reaching for the same utensil. Each brush sent a small, deliberate jolt of awareness through me, and I caught myself noticing every detail: the curve of her wrist, the soft warmth of her hand, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the herbs in the air. Once dinner was ready, we moved to the small dining table. Claire poured wine, her fingers lingering on the bottle as our eyes met for just a moment longer than necessary. She smiled, but it was a slow, knowing smile, one that carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the subtle tension between us. Conversation flowed easily, but there were pauses that spoke louder than words. When I laughed at one of her stories, she reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was simple, domestic even, but my heart thudded in response. I could feel the quiet intensity of her gaze as I swallowed the words that wanted to escape. Words about how magnetic this moment felt, about how I'd never felt this drawn to someone before. At one point, I moved to refill her glass, and our hands collided, lingering a second longer than necessary. Neither of us pulled away immediately, and in that pause, there was a charge, unspoken, gentle, and entirely intoxicating. The warmth of her hand, the steadiness of her presence, the subtle tilt of her head as she smiled at me. All of it seemed to stretch time, making the ordinary act of sharing a meal feel extraordinary. By the end of the evening, I was acutely aware of the tension, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, feeling the pull without knowing whether to leap. We both felt it, I realized, the careful dance of proximity, the unspoken acknowledgement that this connection was real and rare, even if neither of us yet knew how to define it. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Our hands brushed once more in a deliberate, lingering contact, and she gave me that small, knowing smile. "See you tomorrow?" she asked, and in that simple question, I felt the promise of more. More shared moments, more laughter, more of the quiet, magnetic tension that had begun to take over my thoughts. Walking home, I felt the warmth of the evening linger on my skin, and the subtle weight of her attention pressed gently against my chest. Something profound was building, slow and irresistible, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Emotional goal: deepen emotional intimacy, reveal personal vulnerability, and allow the narrator and Claire to connect on a more heartfelt, human level. Narrative progression: the narrator spends an afternoon helping Claire at home. Through shared stories and quiet confessions, they open up emotionally, strengthening their bond while maintaining subtle romantic tension. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on gestures, lingering glances, soft touches, tone of voice, and shared space to create warmth and intimacy. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes ordinary moments feel heavier with meaning. I had come over to help Claire organize some boxes in the attic, but as usual, the task quickly became secondary to conversation. Sunlight streamed through the small window, dust motes floating lazily in the beams, and the attic smelled faintly of old books and lavender, the same scent lingering from her favorite candles downstairs. "You know," she began, pausing mid-sort to pull a box from the shelf, "I've always loved having people around. Not everyone, but the right people, ones who notice more than the surface." Her voice was quiet, soft, almost vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard before. I shifted closer to help her lift a heavy box, and our hands brushed briefly, enough for a subtle warmth to travel on my arm. I caught her glance, gentle and unguarded, and I realized that in that instant, nothing else existed but this shared moment. I think I understand that feeling," I said carefully, leaning slightly against the slanted ceiling to reach a higher shelf. "Sometimes, it's rare to meet someone who notices, someone who sees you." Her smile was small, but it held something deeper than amusement, a flicker of gratitude, even relief. "Exactly," she said. "Most people are busy, distracted, but then there's this rare connection, and you feel lighter somehow, like you're allowed to just exist without pretending." I nodded, words catching in my throat. I wanted to say how much that resonated with me, how her presence had become the highlight of my days, but I held back. Instead, I simply handed her the next box, and our fingers brushed again, deliberate, tender, yet fleeting. We fell into silence for a few moments, sorting and stacking in quiet companionship. Then she sighed softly, settling on an old trunk at the far side of the attic. "I don't usually let people in like this," she admitted, her gaze soft, almost vulnerable. "But you're different. I feel like I can trust you. That's rare for me." Her words hung in the air, heavy and intimate, and I felt a rush of warmth, not just from the compliment, but from the quiet acknowledgement that she was letting me see a side of her few others had witnessed. I wanted to reach out, to brush a hand against hers in reassurance, but I waited, letting the moment breathe, letting the subtle tension build without forcing it. When I finally stood to leave that evening, the air between us felt charged with something tender, unspoken. Our goodbye was simple, a brush of hands as she opened the door, a lingering glance that said more than words ever could. Walking home, I realized that this afternoon had changed everything. The teasing, playful moments of the kitchen had evolved into something more profound. Trust, vulnerability, and the quiet, irresistible pull of connection. And in that quiet pull, I knew that our story was far from over. It was only beginning to bloom. Emotional goal: reach the story's emotional climax with intense, subtle, romantic tension. Show both characters grappling with feelings they are hesitant to voice. Narrative progression: the narrator spends an evening at Claire's house. Through shared laughter, quiet conversation, and small physical touches, the emotional tension between them reaches its peak. They almost confess their feelings, but stop, leaving the connection deepened, yet tenderly unresolved. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on close proximity, lingering touches, body language, soft glances, and the intimacy of shared domestic space. It was one of those rare evenings when everything seemed suspended in amber. I had come to help Claire with dinner again, but this time it felt as though the world outside had disappeared. The kitchen was dimly lit by a single lamp, shadows playing across the counter and her face. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and simmering sauce, and the quiet ticking of the clock seemed to emphasize the steady rhythm of our hearts. She laughed at something I'd said, the sound spilling over the kitchen in a way that made my chest ache with warmth. I reached instinctively to steady a plate she was carrying, and our hands brushed. Just once, but long enough for me to feel the subtle heat of her skin and the gentle strength of her grip. Her gaze met mine, steady and knowing, and in that glance, I saw something I hadn't quite allowed myself to recognize before, a reflection of my own feelings, mirrored back at me with quiet intensity. I felt my pulse quicken, the air around us charged in a way words couldn't capture. "You're different," she said softly, almost hesitating as she placed the plate on the table. There was a pause, a brief flutter in her eyes, as though she were testing the waters, weighing how much to reveal. "Being around you, it's easier, lighter." I swallowed, the words I had rehearsed scattering like smoke in my mind. "I feel the same," I admitted, voice low, almost a whisper, as I reached for the napkin beside me. Our fingers brushed again, this time lingering just slightly, like a small, silent confession. We settled into the small table, eating slowly, sharing stories that drifted from playful to deeply personal. Each laugh, each glance, carried weight now, a tension that hummed beneath the surface, making every ordinary gesture feel extraordinary. At one point, she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and I caught the movement in slow motion, the tenderness of it striking me more than anything I could say aloud. As the evening wore on, the world felt narrow, contained entirely within the kitchen, the table, and the quiet space between us. There was a moment when our hands met on the table, deliberate, electric, yet neither of us moved to close the distance fully. The words hovered on our lips, unspoken yet understood, the almost confession suspended in the air like a held breath. When I finally left, walking down the dimly lit street toward home, the memory of her laughter, the warmth of her touch, and the intensity of her gaze lingered with me. Nothing had been said, yet everything had changed. The teasing, playful connection had deepened into a quiet, potent longing, the kind that makes every ordinary thought, every mundane detail, feel charged with meaning. I knew the next meeting would matter even more, that the pause between what we felt and what we said was shrinking. And in that quiet anticipation, I felt the thrill of something inevitable, the slow, steady bloom of a connection neither of us could ignore. Emotional goal: resolve the story with emotional fulfillment, tender affection, and a sense of closure. Highlight the deep connection between the narrator and Claire, while keeping all romance subtle and appropriate. Narrative progression: the narrator spends another day or evening with Claire. They share laughter, meaningful conversation, and gentle touches that signify the bond that has grown over time. By the end, their connection feels complete, intimate, tender, and emotionally satisfying. Sensory-rich detail and subtle affection. Focus on warmth, shared space, lingering glances, soft touches, and mutual comfort in each other's presence. It was late afternoon when I arrived at Claire's house, carrying a small bouquet of flowers I had picked on the way over. She opened the door before I could knock, wearing that easy, effortless smile that had become etched in my mind over the past weeks. "You brought these for me?" she asked, a playful lift to her eyebrows that made my chest tighten. "I thought they'd look nice in the kitchen," I said, trying to sound casual, though my fingers lingered on the bouquet longer than necessary. She stepped aside to let me in, and I noticed the familiar scent of her perfume mingling with the soft aroma of fresh bread baking. "Well, I think you were right," she said, glancing at the flowers and then at me, her gaze warm and lingering. We spent the afternoon together, cooking a simple meal and sharing stories that range from playful memories to quiet reflections about life. Each laugh we shared carried a deeper warmth now. Each glance a subtle acknowledgement of everything unspoken between us. The kitchen felt alive with our connection, every gesture amplified by the history we had quietly built over these weeks. The teasing, the touches, the fleeting moments of closeness. At one point, while I reached for a mixing bowl, her hand brushed mine again. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was soft, reassuring, and filled with a tender understanding that spoke louder than words. I felt a quiet steadiness in her presence, a sense that we had arrived somewhere together, in a space of trust, warmth, and shared emotion. After dinner, we sat on the small couch in her living room, the evening light fading into a golden glow. Our shoulders touched lightly as we laughed over a story from my childhood, and I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she exhaled. It was domestic, ordinary, yet somehow extraordinary, the intimacy of simply being near someone who truly sees you. "I'm glad you've been coming over," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine with that familiar warmth. "It's been really nice." "Me too," I replied, feeling the weight of everything we hadn't said yet, and realizing we didn't need words to understand one another. As I prepared to leave, she walked me to the door. Our hands brushed one last time, lingering just slightly, and she gave me a small, knowing smile. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet promise that our connection would continue to grow, naturally, gently, without needing to be defined by grand gestures. Walking home, I carried with me the warmth of her presence, the sound of her laughter, and the subtle intimacy of every shared glance and touch. It was a feeling that would stay with me for a long time, tender, fulfilling, and quietly powerful. We had begun with playful teasing in the kitchen, but by the end, we had discovered something far deeper, a connection that was steady, warm, and wholly our own. And in that realization, I knew that some bonds, once formed, could quietly bloom into something beautiful, lasting, and utterly unforgettable.